Just wanted to check that you can hear me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And yeah, there's a few minutes, but if anybody would like to say or ask something or say something, please go ahead. So it's past 10:30 and we can slowly resume. So today, first thing we are going to do is whatever I explained in the last class about Riemann integral, upper integral, lower integral, etc., etc. I've tried to write it out and we will go over the same thing again. So it's like a repeat of what we did last class, and then hopefully we'll move forward. Okay. So the starting point is you have a close bounded interval a to b and you have a bounded function. Okay. So this is very important that the domain is also bounded and the function is also a bounded function. Okay. Now, a partition, it could be defined in many different ways. So now I have, for writing part, I have chosen it. It's simply a finite subset of AB is a partition. So that A, the starting and end point are also there and some finitely many points. Then we order those points and we write them as x0, x1, xm minus 1, xm, where m is arbitrary. Depends that just how many points are there in their partition P. And we choose them so that x0 strictly less than x1, strictly less than up to xm, which is B. Okay. So Now, upper bound on the interval a to b of the function f and with the partition p. So we have four things: partition p and function f both also depend on a to b, but it starts with a, b, f, p. So a, b is unnecessary in some sense, but okay. So the upper bound is simply in each of these subsets, xi minus 1 to xi, you take the supremum of function f and multiply it by the length of the interval, take the sum of the intervals. So this is exactly as we had discussed last class. And the same for lower bound is infimum. Okay. And now it is easy to see that if capital T is a bound of mod f, f is a bounded function, so there will be some capital T such that minus t less than equal to fy less than equal to t for every y in AB. And in that case, this supremum will be less than equal to t and this infimum will be greater than equal to minus t. So we will get that minus t times xk minus 1 is non-negative and sum of that will be b minus a. So minus t times b minus a is always less than equal to lower bound less than equal to upper bound less than equal to capital T times b minus a. And because we are taking the function to be bounded, the supremums and infimums exist as real numbers and we can do this summation. There are no infinities coming up in the expressions. Okay. If we take f to be, we don't require that f is a bounded function, then some of these could be infinities and all these inequalities will then go for a toss. Okay, so we have upper bound, lower bound, and we have made an observation about upper bound and lower bound. So we'll go back to the previous page, but so this is something which I had mentioned last time. We talked about it, but if P and Q are partitions such that P is contained in Q. So now P contained in Q has a meaning P is a finite set, Q is also a finite set. So every point in P is every point is in Q. That's all. Okay. In which case Q is called a refinement of P, and the lower bounds go up, upper bounds come down. Now let me go back to the definition and we can see why that is so. But the statement is lower bounds can only go up when you refine and upper bounds can only come down when you refine. And why is that? Let's look at this. So let's take the simplest case where Q has been obtained by just adding one point somewhere. So what would happen is that, let's say we add a point between this and, okay, somewhere we add a point here. So that will now total will become m plus 1. And so first m minus 1 objects are the same. So their upper and lower bound, the things will be the same. Only the last one will now get bifurcated into 2. Okay. So if xm minus 1 was 9 and xm is 10, now we have added a point between there somewhere. So first m minus 1 sums of k equal to 1 to m minus 1 for P and for Q will be the same. The last one, xk minus 1 to xk or m minus 1 to mk will get split into two parts. So the length will go into two parts. Each one will get multiplied by the supremum. So if supremum in both of them could be the same, or one of them could be smaller, other one could be the supremum. So, so we can see from here that the UFP will go down because one term is split into two parts and the supremums can be the same or going down. Infimum can be the same or can go up. Likewise, we can argue that when we add points, the upper bounds go down, lower bounds go up. So, all right. So, this is the first observation. We had done it last time also, and I have now explained in slightly different language. Notations are somewhat different, but that should not be. That is the first thing you should get used to. That notations is just for the purpose of writing a proof. There is nothing sacrosanct about the notation. So when we add when we refine a partition, the lower bounds go up, upper bounds go down. And the question is, if we keep adding, can they come so close to each other and then collapse into a single point? That is L equal to U. Will they come close to each other? Is the question now. Suppose you have two partitions, they are unrelated. Now these are now sets. So we can always take Q to be their union. And that will be a common partition because P1 will be contained in Q, P2 will be contained in Q. And then, as noted above, for P1 as well as P2, the lower bounds are smaller than LFQ and upper bounds are greater than UFQ. So from here we can get that, let's say, read this inequality with j equal to 2 and read this inequality with j equal to 1, this with j equal to 2. So LABF-P1 less than equal to LFA-FQ. And similarly for U. And these two are the same. They have not changed with j equal to 1, j equal to 2. They are sandwiching these two in between. So we will get that LABF-P1 less than equal to UABF-P2. Okay. Just by bringing in a common partition. Common refinement between the two, we have made this observation. And now, so now if you take supremum of L over all partitions and infimum of U over all partitions, since for every partition P1 and P2 pair this happens, you take supremum over the lower bound, supremum of this and infimum of this will still be supremum of L will be less than equal to U for every P2, and then when we take infimum over P2 we'll get. So what we are able to show is that the lower bound is always less than equal to the upper bound. And remember, 2 sessions ago on Monday or on Tuesday we had showed this in the images form by drawing a graph, and we are looking at area below, area above, etc. So from that also you can see that irrespective of which way you take the supremum, since the area of the curve is always lying in between the upper bound and the lower bound, from that kind of argument, we can set that the supremum of the lower bounds will be less than equal to the infimum of the upper bounds. The same geometry idea, we have now tried to write it algebraically and written here. Okay. And then we come to the definition that.
Sir, if a partition is said to be a subset of another partition, if all the intervals are subsets of the interval of the second partition, right?
Wait. Now, I have not taken intervals. Remember my notation this time. Last time I was a bit vague on that. Here, a partition is a finite subset. Okay.
Okay, sir. So when a partition is said to be subset of another partition, if all the subsets are subsets of the subset.
All the points in the first one are points in the.
Okay, sir. Okay.
All the points are there in the second one. And then clearly what will happen is that now when we think about it as intervals, then each interval in the original partition gets split into the two or more or remains the same. Because you have only added more points.
Okay, sir. Oh, yeah, I got it.
Yeah. So as I explained last time, if we have a simplest kind of partition with only 3 points, A, B, and midpoint, and then we make another one which is 2 other points, these two are not comparable. Okay, but if we add the 2 points here and now make it into 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals or 3 added points in addition to the 2 endpoints, now this will be upper bound for this.
Okay, sir. Yes, I got it.
Okay, so that is the idea, that if we get two incomparable ones, we put all of them together and call that a new partition, and then that will be a common refinement for both. Okay.
Sir, but even if the partitions are not comparable, the upper bound of one is always greater than the lower bound of the other, right?
So that
we proved.
That needs a proof.
Oh, okay, yes, sir.
Yeah. That needs a proof. Simplest thing to observe is that if you get a refinement of the partition, then the upper bounds will come down and lower bounds will go up. That is immediate to observe. Okay. But if you don't have comparable partitions, it is not so immediate to write down. We have just little work is needed to write it out. Okay, so lower is always less than equal to upper, and function is Riemann integrable. Definition. This is a definition. The function is Riemann integrable over this interval if the lower bound is equal to the upper bound. And the reason for putting in AB is that the function f could be even defined on a larger interval. Okay. So for example, a function could be, let's say sin x is defined on the entire real line. Now we are talking about, is it integrable on an interval? Okay. So the common value of these two is called the integral and can be written as integral a to b fx dx. Okay. So the we can see that a constant function is always integrable, because if say f is a constant function, fx equal to 7, then what will happen? upper bound will always, the supremums will always be 7, and this sum will be the length of the interval a to b. So it will be b minus a. Lower bound will also be b minus a, irrespective of any partition. Therefore, supremum will also be the same, and it will be b minus a. So the simplest example of a Riemann integrable function is the constant function.
It will be a telescopic type of thing.
Yeah. So we can keep coming up with more and more examples, but simplest example I just mentioned. Okay.
So,
And
from,
yeah.
so from this definition,
Uh-huh.
like the union of all partitions, like you're defining as finite, right?
Sorry, I didn't get what you
Like you're saying the most refined partition, as in the supremum partition, P, as in not P1 or P2. That's a finite partition you're taking.
I understand your question still.
You're saying LAB is supremum of the lowers of the L's.
Yeah.
Is where P is a partition of AB. So that means P is a finite partition, right?
Yeah.
But for in that case, wouldn't that give like, so if P is a finite partition, then each partition, so each sort of element in the partition, so each interval inside the partition would have a finite length.
Yes.
I mean, what I'm trying to get at is like some functions such as y is equal to x. I don't see how we can conclude that L would be like, it would be Riemann integrable.
Why not?
Because if partitions are finite, then like within that interval length, the
No, but we are taking supremum over all these quantities. So you are missing out the point about supremum.
Oh, okay, I think.
You take a partition, compute this L. So for every partition, you have a L. Now you take supremum. So now we are no longer restricted to finitely many.
Oh, right.
Right.
Okay.
So each P is finite, but we are not saying that all the partitions of at most 20 objects, right? We are not putting a restriction on that. So
Okay.
therefore, when we take supremum over all this, we are allowing very large partitions. Each one should be finite, that's all. So for example, we can divide an interval into n equal parts, compute this lower and upper bounds. Now let n go to infinity. So for fx equal to x, you can do that. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Riemann integrability is when the lower and upper bounds agree, and then the common value is the integral. Now, so for any, let us note from our definition that for any partition P, we will have that L if the partition P is less than or equal to the lower integral greater than, so L and U are also sometimes called the lower integral and upper integral. It's just good to speak, not much use, but so the lower bound for any partition is less than or equal to the lower integral, and the upper bound for any partition is greater than or equal to the upper integral. And so this much we had done last session. Okay, so we have gone over. I'm writing down equations and definition and statements of what we had gone over last class. Perhaps I had mentioned this theorem, but I didn't come around to proving that. So to reduce the headache, how do you show that something is Riemann integrable? Because you are taking supremum over a large number of objects. So here is a beautiful theorem that a bounded function f is Riemann integrable over the interval a to b if and only if. It's like the epsilon delta thing, but there is no delta, there is a partition. Given epsilon, there exists a partition such that UABFP less than upper bound and lower bound for that partition, the distance is at most epsilon. Okay, so from what we have observed, we can also write that this will be equivalently that there exists P0 such that P0 contained in P implies this. All refined partitions, the distance between upper and lower will be less than or equal to epsilon. But that we have already observed that if we refine, the distance between upper and lower only reduces. If P is refined to Q, the distance between Q is distance between upper and lower between Q is always less than or equal to distance between upper and lower between F. So in view of this, it's simplest to simply say that given epsilon, there is a partition for which the upper and lower bound, the difference is less than epsilon. That's it. It follows that for any refined partition also the same property will be true. Okay. So this gives you a way of how do you show that something is Riemann integrable? Well, given epsilon, you somehow come up with a finite partition for which the upper and lower distance is less than epsilon. Done. This one theorem doesn't tell you a way of computing the integral, but at least tells you how can you show that something is integrable. And using this, we'll prove it just now, but for example, you can write down that fx equal to x power k, where k is any integer, is integrable on the interval 0 to 1. By taking an equal partition, you know, you can compute what is the distance and you can make it small enough so that it is less than epsilon, and that's it. So very quickly you can write down a proof that you can compute you can obtain a finite partition such that the upper and lower bound for that partition are less than or equal to any given quantity. Okay. So let's come to the proof. So let's suppose that such a thing is true. That is, given any epsilon, we have a partition so that 5 holds. This equation holds. We have already seen in 4 that the actual distance between U and L is less than or equal to distance between U and L for any partition. So we get that distance between U and L is less than or equal to epsilon because we have already a partition P such that it is less than or equal to epsilon. Now this holds for every epsilon, therefore U and L must be equal. In other words, suppose U is always greater than or equal to L. If U and L are not equal, that is U is bigger than L, okay, get an epsilon which is half the distance between the two, and then this will be violated. This is the usual trick. You want to show that some two objects are equal. If you can show that they're in this case, we already know U is bigger than L. Otherwise, we can take U minus L. So if you want to show that some two objects are equal, you take their difference between the two, take absolute value. If you can show that it is less than epsilon for every epsilon positive, it follows that that is equal to 0. Okay.
Sir, why was it important for the function to be bounded?
Why was it important for the function to be bounded? Well, if the function was not bounded, this U and L could be infinity, one or both.
Oh, okay, sir.
So if you take
So the supremum and infimum may not have existed.
Ah,
Okay.
and various things that we are doing would fall apart. So it is important to have also, if the interval is not a finite interval, then and we have only a finite partition, then one of these intervals could be infinity, xk minus 1, and again things will fall apart. Okay. So it is important that our interval is bounded, close bounded interval, and the function is a bounded function. So it's a matter of convention that this is what is called Riemann integral. It's not that Riemann integral cannot be talked about if you have unbounded function or unbounded interval, but that is called improper Riemann integral in strange terminology. So the equation, at that time it was not clear why I even noted down this. This seemed like obvious from the definition, but this immediately tells you one part of the next major theorem. That if you have one p for which the distance between n and u is less than epsilon, then the distance between L and u, this L over without a partition, the lower integral and upper integral itself is less than epsilon. And if it holds for every epsilon, that means lower and upper integrals are equal. Okay. So one part is done. Now we have to prove the other part. So we have to show that if you have Riemann integrable function, then we can get hold of a partition such that these two are less than epsilon. Distance is less than epsilon. Now suppose f is Riemann integrable. Then using definition of supremum infimum, it follows that for any epsilon, there are partitions P and Q such that the lower bound is supremum over LFP. So if you go a little below the supremum, so L minus epsilon, this is something strictly below the supremum, there will exist a partition so that it is above. It's like you have a set of functions, a set of numbers. You take, if the infimum is equal to 7, sorry, supremum is equal to 7, then you go little below 7, you will be able to find a number inside which is between say 6.99 and 7 if the supremum is 7. So that is the idea. Since the supremum LFP is equal to LF, if you subtract, if you go little below LF, for example, LF minus half epsilon, there will be a P such that LFP is between L epsilon and L epsilon, LF and LF minus half epsilon. And of course, Riemann integrability is telling that L is equal to U. Likewise, for the upper bound, L is equal to U, and this U, it's infimum over all upper bounds. So if you go a little above, so UF plus half epsilon, there will be some object on which we are taking infimums, which will be sandwiched between the two. So there will be a P, a partition P such that the lower bound for that partition is between L and L minus half epsilon, and likewise there is the upper bound. There will be a Q such that the upper bound over Q is between UF and UF plus epsilon, half epsilon. Now, you take a common partition between this P and Q. So the property will continue to hold because LFP star will be between LFP and the supremum, and likewise. So we take a common partition refinement P star, PQ, and then we get both the properties, and in turn, they tell you that the U for P star and L for P star is less than equal to epsilon. So the result is extremely important. Proof actually is very simple, for example, both ways. Okay. That the function is Riemann integrable if and only if you have a partition such that the upper and lower bounds differ by less than epsilon.
Sir, common refinement of P and Q means the union of all points in P and Q.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, as I said, last time I had left this notion of a partition kind of vague. I said you can take it to be the subset, you can take it to be these intervals, etc., etc. Today I have been precise. It makes it easy to write that the partition is simply a subset.
Sir?
Yeah.
Could you scroll down to the page the inequality again? I didn't, the final inequality. I didn't fully get why that's true. I want to look at it again.
This one.
Yes, sir. The very last step. I didn't get why from the two inequalities it follows, the result follows.
Yeah, these two.
Yes, sir. Like the ones near the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Those. I'm not sure why. I'm not getting why that's true. Sorry, I'm not getting why that implies the result.
Oh, because you see here,
Yeah.
LP star is bigger than equal to LF minus half. So you look at this one, okay, and you look at this one. But at the same time, you have that LF is same as UF. So if I put up a common notation, suppose beta okay, let's call that beta, the integral. Okay, then this quantity is beta minus half epsilon is less than equal to LF at P star, and UF at P star is less than equal to beta plus half epsilon. So the distance between L star and UP star is at most epsilon. That's all.
Yeah, got it, sir. Yeah, thank you.
So the remember, all these definitions and all this is hindsight. People have tried various ways of defining these objects, and now this is the simplest. This is the one for which all these statements come out very cleanly. For example, let's go back and instead of taking upper bounds over all partitions, suppose we had started off by saying that for every integer n, you just divide the interval a to b into n equal parts. Okay. And then the upper bound for n equal parts, and now take the limit of this if it exists, etc., etc. That could have been an approach tried by some, and then for some sets of functions that one works, for some sets of functions it doesn't work. Okay. Whereas to write down proofs, this seems like the kind of the easiest one, and this is how it is done in most books now. But starting point could have been many different ways. And one of the problems when you take n and n, so the partition obtained by n equal parts and n plus 1 equal parts are not comparable, and already some of our statements may go haywire. Well, that could be addressed by, instead of taking partition in n steps, we can always take partition in 2 power n steps. So each time only you divide every interval into 2 parts. Well, again, some proofs will work easily that way, but some may not work easily that way. So eventually, this is the accepted one. But people would have tried various different ways of proving things, stating things. Okay.
Sir, I had another question about the proof.
Sure.
It seemed to me we didn't need anywhere that P and Q. Sorry, that we're taking the same partition P. So it seems that the result would hold for 2 different partitions P and Q. So, sorry, sir.
No, what is your question? I'm in between. I missed the voice.
So my question is that it seems that this result would hold for 2 different partitions P and Q. That is a bounded function F.
This
Sorry,
theorem.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that is okay.
Yeah, so there exist partitions P1 and P2 such that UABF P1 and UABF P2 LF. Yeah, but now you think about, you want to use this theorem. Okay. It's easier if you have to just produce one partition rather than 2 distinct partitions. That's all.
Okay. So actually I was thinking, might it not be better to have the ability to produce 2 partitions if we need to? So if we're not able to get like one partition, which satisfies.
Yeah, but I couldn't find any example of that, and everybody uses this framework. That's all. Okay.
Right. No, that makes sense, sir. I mean, I just thought, but it might not be true. So yeah, thank you, sir.
So, essentially the only additional thing we have done from what we had done last class is to now prove this theorem that function is Riemann integrable if and only if you can get a hold of a partition so that the upper and lower bounds computed for that partition differ by at most epsilon. So, as I have stated earlier also, and tried to stress, you have to remember that you, in mathematics, especially this formal way of doing mathematics, you should be able to write the proofs the way I have written, and you should also be able to explain the theorem in a understandable language, rather than you say, if given epsilon positive, there exists a partition P such that UABFP minus LABFP less than equal to epsilon. Now, if you read such a statement, you hear such a statement, unless you write it down on a piece of paper, your brain is not going to be able to digest what you have said, right? Whereas if I say that, well, given a function, there exists a partition such that the upper and lower bounds for that partition differ by at most epsilon. That is something that your brain can digest immediately, or process immediately. So this ability to write formal mathematics at the same time, being able to explain what we mean in simple language is important. In a language that is easily understandable. Okay. So, so now let's think about now what can we do. Simplest, now we have to start function. We had done, if you have 2 continuous functions, their sum is a continuous function. So now let's start. If f and g are 2 bounded functions, h is equal to f plus g, using that supremum of h over any interval is always less than or equal to supremum of f over that interval plus supremum of g over that interval. So using this simple observation, we can verify that u of f over p and u of g over p, sum of these two, sum of the upper bounds of these two integrals is always greater than equal to the upper bound for the sum. Let's go back to this. Upper bound for f is this supremum. Upper bound for g will be the same thing with the supremum of gy. And if we add the two, the supremum taken separately and then adding is always more than adding and then taking supremum. So if f is something like this, fx equal to 1 minus x and gx is equal to x. So supremums and infimums, if you subtract the two, the supremum infimum will be just the flat in the middle point. If f plus g itself is flat, the sum of the two. So by taking examples, you can convince yourself that if you take the sum of the upper bounds is always less than equal to upper bound of the sum, greater than equal to upper bound of the sum, and the similar thing for the lower bound. So yeah. And we can cook up lots of examples. F can be equal to 1 on the interval 0 to half and is 0 from half to 1. And G could be the other way. And therefore, upper bound of each is 1, upper bound of the sum is still 1 in the interval. So upper sums of upper bounds is greater than equal to upper bound of the sum, and likewise lower bounds of each is less than equal to lower bound for the sum. Why this? I wrote small l typo mistake. This is capital L. So we see here that upper bound for the integral or upper integral. So I have not written that as introduced as a notation, but this is u of f. When the p is not there, that's the upper integral, and this upper integral of f and upper integral of g, sum is greater than equal to upper integral of f plus g, and lower integral of f plus lower integral of g is less than equal to lower integral of f plus g. But if f and g are integrable, what does that mean? The upper one is equal to this lower one, this one is equal to this one. So it will force that these two have to be equal. That's it. Okay. So we have that if f and g are Riemann integrable, then so is f plus g, and then we have sum of the integrals is equal to integral of the sum or integral of h. That's it. So I'll listed two things as exercise. They are easy to do. I will talk it up, but then you have to be able to write out the argument. So suppose f is an integrable function, Riemann integrable on a to b, and h be equal to alpha times fx for a constant alpha. Multiplying by, so we have added two things, now we are multiplying by constant. To show that h is Riemann integrable and the integral of alpha f is equal to alpha times integral of f. Fairly straightforward, but still sometimes one needs to write it up, be able to write it out. In your algebra class, you would be doing such things, right? You have two objects, two functions, you add them, you take linear combinations of them. These are all linear transformations. So, what we are saying is this Riemann integrable things works well with linear transformations of functions. So straightforward to write this, but second one is a little more interesting, not difficult to write, but a little more interesting. So suppose f is from a to c, a bounded function, and suppose you get a point B which is in between A and C. And then suppose you are told that f is Riemann integrable on A to B and f is Riemann integrable on B to C. Then it is Riemann integrable on A to C, and then the integral on A to C is sum of the two integrals. And if we connect this integration idea to that of areas, area under the curve, as we had done in the Monday morning or Tuesday's session, then this is almost obvious. But now in our mathematical writing, way of writing, you will be able to argue this. And it can be proved, can be written in many different ways. You separately argue for upper bounds and lower bounds and show that the upper bound for A to C is equal to sum of these two upper bounds, similarly lower bounds. Or you can use this theorem about given epsilon, there is a partition. So, for example, A to B, it is integrable. So, given an epsilon, there is a partition P for of A to B. Likewise, there is a partition of B to C. Put the two together, you will get a partition of A to C. And that will become, this gap will be at most 2 epsilon. So, if you want to do epsilon, then you start with epsilon by 2's. So, the proof can be worked out for that exercise in different ways. Okay. Any questions? So, I've left blank space to be able to answer questions, but there are no questions, so it's okay. All right, so the major result of the day, okay, this is going to be the major result of the day. That is, if f is a continuous function on a closed bounded interval, then it is Riemann integrable period, full stop. That is the state statement. And so one major theorem we did was this epsilon partition business. Given epsilon, there is a partition for Riemann integrability. And now our major result is for the day, of the day, is that if you have a continuous function on a bounded interval, it is Riemann integrable. And once again, the proof can be written in many different ways. So this morning I thought of writing it in this format, but you can come up with different formats. All right. So for every integer m, let us write xmk to be these points. So I am taking Pm to be in m plus 1 points of equal length. Each of them, the length between successive ones is 1 over m. That is the idea. The interval AB I have divided into n many subintervals, and then they listed the points as xmk, k between 1 and 0 and m. And let me write umk to be the infimum in the kth interval and vmk to be the supremum in the kth interval. So the kth interval is xmk minus 1 to xmk. That is my kth interval. Okay. K from 1 to m, so to speak. Now, because our intervals are equal, the distance, the xk minus 1, that kind of an object that we had, each of them will be only 1 over m b minus a. So the lower bound for this Pm is simply umk 1 over m b minus a. Now 1 over m b minus a is common, we can be pulled out, and then summation over k equal to 1 to m umk. So for this partition, I can explicitly compute what is my lower bound. I can explicitly compute what is my upper bound. Therefore, if you take the difference between the two, b minus a times 1 by m is common, so we can take it out. And now summation k equal to 1 to m, vmk minus umk. umk is smaller than vmk, so that is, and we have to 1 over m times the sum. So 1 over m times the sum is less than equal to the maximum of all these objects. So here 1 less than equal to k less than equal to m. Maximum is taken over vmk minus umk between 1 and n. So once again, we have computed LF on PM and UF for this partition PM. And since they are equally spaced, the partition is equally spaced, the length of each subinterval is equal to 1 over m b minus a, and therefore it is just simply the maximums and the minimums and the maximums on each of those intervals. And we subtract the two and then take the maximum. So it is less than equal to b minus a times this maximum. Now, let's carefully look at what is umk and vmk. umk and vmk are infimum and supremum on the same interval. xmk minus 1 and xmk. So I claim that this Vmk minus umk is always less than equal to alpha m, where alpha m is this object. We have divided into several intervals. In each interval, we are taking the maximum and the minimum. So, maximum and minimum, the gap will always be less than equal to the maximum between 2 points, both in the same interval. U, y and z, such that y and z, the distance is less than equal to 1 over n. I will complete this proof this way I have written, and I will return to this point once again. If you are, see in a class, I can see the faces and figure out whether when some thing is being understood by most and some is going flat, but I can't see that here. So we get that UFPM minus LFPM is less than equal to B minus A times alpha M. We have already, I had listed the main things from there, where alpha M is this maximum. Now, since F is continuous, it is uniformly continuous. So given epsilon, we have a delta such that whenever x minus y, the supremum of x minus y, fx, fy minus fz, supremum of these objects where y and z are less than equal to delta, can be made smaller than any given quantity. So I can make it smaller than epsilon by 2 times b minus a as well. Given epsilon, I can make it smaller than any pre-assigned value. So I take that assigned value to be epsilon by 2 b minus a. And now we can choose any m such that 1 by m is less than delta. And we will get that upper bound for Pm minus lower bound for Pm is less than equal to epsilon.
Sir, f of sir, f is uniformly continuous, but this is the supremum, right?
Yeah. So here is the statement. Let's for a minute forget integration. Suppose
oh, okay, sir. Yes, I got it. Sir.
so the definition means for all epsilon there exists a delta.
F of g of y.
This implies,
So by definition, the least upper bound is less than or equal to epsilon.
only thing is it may not be strictly less than epsilon, it can be at most epsilon. So the supremum is epsilon, that's all. It can be less than equal to epsilon, that's all.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to explain this part that L minus U let's first write down here what is this quantity will be less than equal to right? B minus A times 1 by M, VMK minus UMK, right? And each of VMK minus UMK will be less than equal to this alpha, because VMK is maximum over an interval. This is also minimum over the same interval. So their gap is less than equal to, you take 2 points in that interval and then take the maximum distance between them. That is the idea. Let's take fx equal to x cube. And let's take A is 0, B is 1, and M is 10. Let's say. Okay. So so these are our XMKs. Now, what is VMK? VMK is supremum So, in this case, since it's an increasing function, XMK will be simply the value at the upper end point. Upper end point is k by 10 cube. So, lower bound will be the value at the lower end point. It will be k minus 1 by 10 cube. And so we'll have 1 by 10 cube, k cube minus k minus 1 cube. So the one will be the sum and the other will be the minus k minus 1. So you can do some algebra and get hold of this expression. So for every k, we'll get an upper bound, and this will be less than perhaps 1 by 10 or something like that. So perhaps you can take 1 or 2 examples and try to compute and verify that what I have claimed is true, or if not convinced, let me know. We'll try to figure out some other way of explaining the proof. But another way of looking at it is, this is B minus A is as it is. This is average of some 20 values. Here is average of another 20 values. The gap will always be less than equal to the gap between the corresponding values. You take average of 10 numbers, take another average of another 10 numbers. The gap between the averages is always less than equal to the largest gap between the successive numbers. So 10 of you, each one is asked to pick 2 numbers, one always less than equal to the other. And if you take average of the 10 lower numbers and average of the 10 upper numbers, the gap in the averages will be the gap will always be less than equal to the gap between the upper and lower numbers chosen by any of the 10 people in the. So this is a very simple statement that nothing to do with our context, but difference between these two averages is at most equal to the maximum between the corresponding values. That's it. Okay. So now pencil power is going off or what, I don't know. It did not, it stopped responding on this. I think its power is down completely. Okay. So not much time left. So anyway, it doesn't matter for the day, but the point I was trying to do is the following. Suppose f is a Riemann integrable function. And we can take a to be 0, b to be 1. Okay. Suppose I take any one point, it could be 0, it could be 1, or it could be some point in between, let's say half. So I define a new function g, which is equal to f everywhere except at the point half. At the point half, I define g to be equal to -7, let's say. All right, so you know what I have done now. F is a Riemann integrable function. I have picked one point on that interval a to b. It could be the endpoints or it could be somewhere in between. At that point, I have redefined the function to be some other value. I want to be able to argue that the new function g is still integrable. And the point is that since the choice of the partition is in our hand, okay, with given an epsilon, we choose a partition for so that the upper and lower for the f in that partition is less than epsilon. Now that in that I can always add more points. So in that I can add this point half. Or better than adding point half, the point at which we have changed, we add a little bit to the below and a little bit to above that and add that. Half minus 1/1000 and half plus 1/1000. So what happens is that except for this one interval where we have added a half minus 1000 and a half plus 1000, everywhere else f and g are always equal and their upper and lower bounds are the same. Only on this small interval, things have changed. But the total change is at most equal to the upper bound of the f and g, etc. times the length of the interval which of change. So together, let's see if it's starting to write now. I don't know what went wrong. The pencil is refusing to write. So here is the statement that if f is Riemann integrable and g is such that g agrees with f at all but 1 points on the domain, then g is also Riemann integrable and integrals are the same. to
Sir,
change.
G is defined in an open interval.
No, G is also defined on the same interval A to B.
Okay, yeah. But at one point, it does not agree with it. Okay.
Okay. At one point, I have given it a different value.
Sir, then we can prove that the supremum of G minus the supremum in the difference between supremum and infimum is greater than epsilon only for a single party, only for a single. I mean, only for a single partition.
Yeah,
I mean,
that is the idea. And
so making delta small, we can make it less than epsilon.
That's true. Yeah, okay. So now I have recovered my pencil. So F is Riemann integrable.
So it is also trivially satisfied for finite number of points.
Yes.
But it is also true for probably countable number of points. And in more generally,
where there is so not all countable many points. So there is so let's first observe for one, and from one to finitely many, it is trivially true. Okay.
Yes.
The rational numbers are countable, right?
Yeah, and you change on all rational numbers, then it doesn't work.
Yes, yeah. The last class's example.
Yeah. So
okay, so countable number that are in dense set.
You see, okay, let's so
any of the subset of that index.
See, one can speculate and get, and you can read about these things. Okay? But the main thing is that we do not want to characterize, what all changes will not change in Riemann integrability. There is a full statement about F is Riemann integrable if and only if, but we are not going towards that theorem. Okay. So all we want to stress is that if you change it at finitely many points, it doesn't change the integral. That's it. Okay. And then if you have to go into it, we can go into, if you're changing it in countably many points, and if the set of points which are in its closure is at most so and so, etc., one can go on and on. Okay. But we do not want to go in that direction. We all know is that there can be, if I change a function at only points of the type 1 over n on a unit interval, okay, if I change a function only at the points 1 over n, then no problem. It will still remain Riemann integrable. But if you change it at all rational numbers, it is no longer true. Okay.
So will it be like if it is not dense in any of the subset of A comma, any of the closed subset?
Wait. The way of one characterizes it not through this denseness, etc., it goes in another direction. The set of points have to have a Lebesgue. You have to bring in the Lebesgue theory, and using that one can characterize.
Almost everywhere is that. So like.
Yeah. So continuity.
Rationals are also almost everywhere.
You see, please don't go on speculating in the class.
Okay.
Separately, you can talk to me, because this only confuses the others, you see.
Okay, sir.
If you want to discuss this with me, you alone or a few others, we can discuss, but we do not want to go into the characterization of which all changes will not change the different integrability. Okay, because to really resolve that issue, one needs to go into more mathematical concepts. Otherwise, we can debate through examples. Okay, so the main thing is that you change it at finitely many points, the integrability does not change. Okay, that is fixed. Finitely many points, it doesn't matter. And that automatically observes that, you don't have to be continuous to get Riemann integrable, because you can always change at finitely many points and distort the continuity of the function. It still remains Riemann integrable. Okay. So while continuity gives you the most easy way of verifying that something is Riemann integrable, it is not at all necessary. But interesting examples all come from here. This or changing it at few points where you can see that things will not going to get disturbed. All right, so time is up and those who want to leave can leave, but others can stay. We can discuss a few more minutes if people want to ask questions.
Sir?
Yeah.
So far, we've been only defining the Riemann integral for closed bounded domains.
Yeah.
Do we define it at all for open intervals or no?
See, it is the boundedness of the interval which is important. Open now already, you know, we have already done that. If it's only open interval, you arbitrarily define it at the endpoints and consider it at closed interval. It really doesn't matter.
Okay. So, right. So as long as it doesn't shoot off at the endpoints, we can still just define it arbitrarily. It doesn't even have to have a limit necessarily.
Yeah.
We can define it arbitrarily and still, okay.
And if
right.
And if you have a bounded function, it will not shoot off.
Right. Yeah.
And the limit need not even exist.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay.
Got it, sir. Thank you.
But this observation meant the final thing that we did. Continuous then Riemann integrable may not work on an open interval. Because this proof certainly won't work because this is using
uniform continuity. Right.
Okay. This proof will not work. Whether it works or not, one will have to keep figuring out.
Okay, sir. Okay. Got it, sir.
And an example that you take sine 1 over x on the open interval 0 to 1 or 0 to pi. Sine of 1 over x.
Right. Okay.
So it doesn't have a limit as x goes to 0.
Yeah.
So you can't make it continuous by just, you can add a point 0 and define the function to be 0, but it doesn't give you continuity.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But in this example, since essentially we are only changing, the problem is only happening at one point, we can struggle and prove that actually it is still integrable.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll do a little bit on those lines, the so-called improper integrals.
Okay, sir. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Got it, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Because it's one thing to say we'll only do this, but then examples where we want to use these things are not just in this class. There are other examples so that we would like to do. So we would like to allow infinite the unbounded functions as well as unbounded intervals. Okay.
Right. Yes, makes sense, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, Bijan, we can come to your thing about set of points. Yeah. So what was your point?
No, I don't know if that's correct. If the set of points, the set of countable points are in dense in any of the subset of A comma B, then it would still be Riemann integral.
Wait. What is your point? If the set of points is not dense in what?
Countable and is not dense in any of the subset of A comma B.
Any of the subset of?
A comma B, the closed interval.
How will you get a countable sequence which is not dense? We'll have a limit point.
Yeah. The 1 by n sequence isn't dense, right? The 1 by n points in A comma B are dense in A comma B. And here we are having that integral f equal to integral g. but the rational points are dense in A comma B. So I don't know if this is correct calculation.
Well, probably correct, but
So just somewhat intuitively, so for this proof for one point, I think how we did it was we sort of isolated that single point and said that you can make that interval so small that the contribution of that to the sum becomes negligible. So I think we could do that for something that's not dense also, because you can always make that interval so small that it does not include any other of these quote unquote bad points in it.
yeah,
so
but they all may not be in the same interval. So you have to be careful. So one statement I'll make is, suppose that you are changing the function at points, let's call that alpha n, okay, between a, b. Okay. Now, if
No, sir. What I meant is, I guess for concreteness, if we take 1 by n, we can choose a partition which isolates each of those elements. So the partition will include a point such that each of the elements 1 by n is isolated. And then the rest of the function behaves very nicely. And so perhaps we can do the same thing as the
well.
Actually, in 1 by n case, I mean, if we choose a subset that contains 0, it will contain infinitely many points. There will only be finitely many points outside the set containing 0, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, we can.
So to give you answer, in Lebesgue theory that you will not be doing, okay, you start defining length of a subset of real numbers. Okay, let's say unit interval. So we can, of course, length of an interval is, we know what it is, but how far can you go? And then you can define length of an interval, and using that one can argue about how changing function in that many points will change or not, etc. But okay. So in some of these things, you see, when you want to have a full characterization, you can get into very muddy waters. You will need a lot more notions than we have done till now. Okay. So we refrain and we simply do the things which simple things which we can deduce based on what we have done. Okay. So we so this continuity, I can say that Riemann integrability says essentially that it is continuous for most points. Now, what is most points? That again requires the Lebesgue theory. The set of points at which the function is not continuous can be made very small. But small, large in the sense of what is called Lebesgue theory. So we will not get into that mode. Our examples will be continuous functions or things which are essentially continuous, but we have changed it a few times, few points, playing with it, etc. Straightforward way. And just stick to that. So we will not get into, given a function f, how can we characterize, is it Riemann integrable or not? Well, you compute the upper and lower integral and see if they are equal. That's it. We are not getting into any other characterization of Riemann integrability. Okay. But not that it cannot be done. It can be done, but it requires more machinery than is possible in our course for now.
So, speaking of continuity, there's actually a doubt that I had, which I
Yeah.
wanted to ask. So far, for discontinuities, we've seen things which either shoot off to infinity at a point, or there's a jump, or it's highly oscillating. So I was wondering if there are any other kinds of discontinuities.
I mean,
Because sometimes the context is sometimes if there's like a result which I want to intuitively check, like what is going on, I might want to try and check for what happens if there's a jump, what happens if it shoots off to infinity, what happens if there's oscillations. But
three are not. No. That's only an intuitive way of checking. If it works in all these three cases, there is no guarantee that it will work.
right, which is why I was asking this question.
So I think these are only examples.
Okay.
It can vary in 100 different ways, I suppose. I don't know how to characterize them, but
Okay.
But no, going beyond continuity can be fairly complicated.
Okay. Got it, sir. Yeah, so I did think that these would not be it. I just wasn't able to think of like other kinds of functions. So yeah, I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, what should I say? I mean, in fact, the set of objects that we can talk about is very small. There are so many objects that we can't even write down what they are. You see?
Right. Yeah.
So I just now mentioned that in Lebesgue theory, you talk about lengths of subsets of unit interval, let's say. Okay. And when I teach that course, I tell them that, describing the sets for which we can talk about lengths is easy, for which we can assign a length. Even to show that there exists a function or there exists a subset on which we can't assign a length is a very complicated object.
Right. Okay, sir. Yeah.
Okay. So,
I think I have seen the proof once. It was quite involved.
Which one?
That there is a set for which we cannot assign such a notion of length. And it was quite involved. Yeah.
Yeah. It's extremely involved. Because then you have to first mean by what do you mean by defining a length? Then you need that, okay, you need that it should have some properties. What are those properties? So it goes in a long spiral.
Right, yeah.
And need to do that if you are doing Lebesgue theory, but otherwise it is too complicated. And as I said, maybe in one of the optional courses in BSc it may come up, but certainly not in any core program, not in any of the core courses, and maybe are optional only in MSc. But
yeah, from what I saw, it's in one of the graduate analysis courses. I don't think it's there as a core course in BSc at all.
No.
Yeah.
And I can tell you another thing, that the people who also study not just math, but along with it study probability theory and at an advanced level, they are far more comfortable doing this than those who have not done probability but have done only math.
Okay, I think you'd mentioned that Lebesgue theory plays an important role in probability theory, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And one of the reasons could be that in math, you are only dealing with the length measure, or also called the Lebesgue measure, or its length, area, volume, etc. But only one example that you are interested in. Whereas in probability theory, there is a plethora of examples that you are interested in. So you study those objects more carefully.
Okay, right, okay.
But one question will be, if there is Lebesgue theory, then why are we doing Riemann theory? if Lebesgue theory kind of overshadows Riemann theory. Well, yes and no. Overshadows Riemann theory when it comes to integrals on real line or even in R2 or Rn. But there are scenarios where we can't have a corresponding Lebesgue theory, but we have a corresponding Riemann theory. So that is one reason why we continue to study Riemann theory as well. And of course, it can be taught in BSc first year, but Lebesgue theory to teach will be very complicated. You will need a lot more formal mathematics before it can be done. That could be the other reason.
Okay. Okay. Right.
So you would have, changing topics, you would have seen I sent a set of exercises, and I urge, as I had written, I urge each of you to first read them and try to see which ones you can do, which one you cannot do, which one you have no clue. Think about those, talk to groups of students, talk to TAs or to me next week when we'll assign a time. Okay. But it's a must that you spend some time trying to understand how much you are able to solve. Even if not a full proof, if you are, do you even have an idea of how you proceed? Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, regarding the problem set, I mean, could you just look at the first problem? I mean, I was just asking whether it is important for the set to be bounded in it or not.
Okay, let me just see. First problem.
Yes, sir.
Well, only because we have defined lim sup, etc., only for bounded functions. That's why it is important to say it is also bounded. So you can say it is bounded.
All right, sir. I mean, I was thinking whether we separately need to prove, I mean, somehow we can prove boundedness from the conditions given or not. That's why.
No, you can only show bounded above, you can't show bounded below. So yeah, I have not defined lim sup otherwise. So yeah, so you can take AN to be bounded. Yes.
Okay, sir.
First problem, yeah. Yeah.
The concept of the successor in the sense of piano says does every countable set has to have any successor for any?
No, wait a minute, wait a minute. What is your question? What is the question again?
Does any countable set has to have a successor of each element?
Success. What is the definition of successor then?
Successor in the sense of piano system, that is in like there will be a next element with respect to the order. Oh yes, there will be a next element with respect to the order.
No, but then a countable set, where is the order?
Countable sets of real number, I mean countable subsets of real number.
No, so collection of countable subsets or one countable subset?
One countable subset, element of one countable subset, which are real numbers. So order is defined there.
So you have one countable set of real numbers.
Yeah.
Now, what is your question?
Yes. Do we have successor defined on each element of that countable set?
May not be.
Oh, but isn't by definition a countable set something which is bijective with the natural numbers?
So you see, this whole thing is about, this is half-baked information that you are giving and half-baked definition.
Yes, sir. I don't know the actual definitions. That's what I assumed.
But we have the rationals as countable.
No,
right?
you see,
But
if
in that
you
case,
a countable set and say that does everyone have a successor? The answer is no, because there may not be any next element to any element. They could be just decreasing down.
so we can just take the example of the rationals, right? It is countable, the
Yeah.
set of rationals, but those do not have next rational.
Yeah, I thought that, but rationals are also like, as Anand told, bijective to n, which is again which has successor. So we can define
That's why the whole problem is coming, because we do not have to begin with the notion of what do you mean by successor. Okay.
Like
Oh,
I
yeah,
I
that's right.
cannot
If
put
you're saying
successor
with,
in the sense,
okay, okay.
in the sense of that Peano's axiom, what it defines
Peano's
successor of a
axiom is not
natural.
applicable to rational numbers. So you know you can't mix and match things this way. Okay.
Yeah. Now, I mean, when we are extending natural number to rational numbers, we usually there is a remark that we are losing something, that is we don't have a successor in rational number. So
that means you cannot define a notion of successor so that it will work the same way. That's all.
but if there is a if it is countable and we have a bijection between natural number and rational number, then if we define that successor in that manner with respect to that natural number.
But then you also want that successor means in between there should be no one in your
Yes. That's what that is the
Else.
definition of right. Okay. So okay.
So this is what I'm saying, you know, mix and matching different things. So you put down what exactly do you mean by successor, and then we can
Yes,
talk.
that is the definition of successor I was implying. So yes. Okay, now it's understood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right then. Bye.
Thank you, sir.